What happens when one of television's most respected actors comes face to face with a host who's crossed every line imaginable? You won't believe what unfolds when Bryan Cranston sits down for what should have been a routine promotional interview, only to find himself trapped in a verbal battlefield that would leave audiences stunned and social media exploding with outrage. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you're not going to believe what unfolds when Hollywood's gentleman collides with late-night television's most controversial host in a confrontation that nobody saw coming. The atmosphere in Studio 6A was electric as Bryan Cranston made his way to the familiar interview chair, the audience erupting in warm applause for the beloved Breaking Bad star. What seemed like another typical late-night appearance to promote his latest project would soon devolve into one of the most uncomfortable and explosive confrontations in recent television history. The tension was palpable from the moment Cranston settled into his seat, though neither the studio audience nor viewers at home could have predicted the verbal warfare that was about to erupt. "Bryan Cranston, everybody," Jimmy Kimmel announced with his signature grin, but there was something different in his demeanor tonight. His usual playful energy seemed tinged with an edge that those familiar with his recent controversial interviews would recognize immediately. "So great to have you back on the show. You know, I've been looking forward to this conversation because there's so much I want to talk to you about." Cranston, ever the professional, smiled graciously and adjusted his jacket. "Always a pleasure to be here, Jimmy. Thanks for having me. Well, before we get into your new project, I have to ask you about something that's been on my mind," Kimmel began, his tone shifting noticeably. "You've been pretty vocal lately about certain political issues, and I'm curious about your perspective on some of the, shall we say, more controversial stances you've taken." The camera captured Cranston's subtle shift in posture, his media-trained smile faltering slightly. "I think it's important for people to speak their minds, Jimmy. We live in a democracy where discourse should be encouraged, not discouraged." "Right, right," Kimmel nodded, but his expression suggested he wasn't entirely satisfied with that diplomatic response. "But don't you think there's a responsibility that comes with your platform? I mean, when you make certain statements, people listen. They take what you say seriously. And they should," Cranston replied, his voice carrying a hint of steel. "I don't speak carelessly about issues I care about. I research, I think, and I form my opinions based on facts and personal conviction." The studio audience began to sense the underlying tension, their applause becoming more scattered and uncertain. Kimmel leaned forward in his chair, his famous smile now appearing more like a grimace. "But facts can be interpreted different ways, can't they? I mean, your recent comments about the entertainment industry's responsibility to address social issues have rubbed some people the wrong way." "Which people?" Cranston asked pointedly, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Because I'd argue that art has always been a vehicle for social commentary. From Shakespeare to Steinbeck to, yes, even television shows like Breaking Bad. Art reflects society, and sometimes it challenges society to be better. Sure, but there's a difference between art and lecturing your audience." Kimmel shot back, his tone becoming more aggressive. "Some would say that actors should stick to acting instead of trying to be political commentators." The comment hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Cranston's jaw tightened visibly, and for a moment, the only sound in the studio was the uncomfortable shuffling of audience members who were beginning to realize they were witnessing something far more intense than a typical celebrity interview. "Some would say that," Cranston replied slowly, his voice dangerously quiet. "But I'd argue that citizenship doesn't end when you walk onto a movie set. I'd argue that having a platform gives you a responsibility to use it thoughtfully, not just to sell products or make people laugh." "Thoughtfully," Kimmel repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Is that what you call it when you compare certain political figures to characters from your own shows? Because that seemed less thoughtful and more like, I don't know, attention-seeking." The studio fell silent. Even the cameramen seemed to hold their breath as Cranston slowly leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving Kimmel's face. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. The affable actor was disappearing, replaced by something far more formidable. "Attention-seeking," Cranston repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "Jimmy, I've been in this business for over 30 years. I've won Emmys. I've been nominated for Oscars. I've had the privilege of working with some of the most talented people in the industry. Do you really think I need to manufacture controversy to get attention? I don't know. Kimmel shrugged, his smirk growing wider. Do you? The question was like a match thrown into gasoline. Cranston's composure cracked visibly, his hands gripping the arms of his chair as he struggled to maintain his professional demeanor. The audience could feel the electricity in the air, the palpable sense that they were witnessing something unprecedented. You know what, Jimmy? Cranston said, his voice rising slightly. I came here tonight to talk about my work, to discuss a project I'm passionate about with people who might be interested in seeing it. I didn't come here to be ambushed by someone who seems more interested in creating controversy than having a genuine conversation. Ambushed? Kimmel laughed, but there was no humor in it. This is a talk show, Bryan. We talk. Sometimes those conversations get a little uncomfortable, but that's what makes good television, right? The mask was completely off now. Both men were staring at each other with undisguised hostility, the pretense of friendly banter abandoned entirely. The studio audience sat in stunned silence, unsure whether to applaud, boo, or simply leave. This was no longer entertainment. This was a public execution disguised as an interview. Good television, Cranston repeated, shaking his head slowly. Is that what you think this is? Because from where I'm sitting, this feels like a hack comedian trying to make himself relevant by tearing down people who've actually accomplished something. The words hit Kimmel like a physical blow. His face flushed red, and for a moment, he seemed genuinely speechless. The camera captured every micro-expression, every telltale sign that the host was losing control of both the interview and himself. Excuse me. Kimmel finally managed, his voice tight with barely contained rage. But Cranston was just getting started, and the look in his eyes suggested that whatever came next would be even more devastating. You want to talk about accomplishments, Jimmy? Cranston continued, his voice gaining momentum like a freight train building speed. Let's talk about accomplishments. You've built a career on making fun of people, on cheap shots and manufactured outrage. You hide behind this folksy, everyman persona while you tear people down for entertainment. That's not comedy, that's cowardice. The studio erupted in shocked murmurs. Several audience members could be heard gasping audibly, while others began whispering frantically to their neighbors. This wasn't the polite Hollywood disagreement they might have expected. This was a full-scale character assassination happening. In real time on national television, Kimmel's face cycled through several shades of red before settling on a dangerous purple. His hands were visibly shaking as he gripped his note cards, his knuckles white with tension. Cowardice? He sputtered. You want to talk about cowardice? How about hiding behind your Emmy wins every time someone calls you out on your political grandstanding? Political grandstanding. Cranston shot back, his voice rising to match Kimmel's intensity. I spoke out against injustice. I used my platform to highlight issues that matter to millions of Americans. What have you done besides mock people from behind your desk like some playground bully who never grew up? The comparison to a playground bully struck home. Kimmel's jaw worked silently for several seconds, his face contorting with barely suppressed fury. The cameras captured every moment of his struggle for composure, every crack in the facade he'd built over years in late-night television. At least I don't pretend to be something I'm not, Kimmel finally managed, his voice dripping with venom. At least I don't play a tough guy on TV and then cry about it when someone challenges me in real life. The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Cranston's eyes flashed with something primal, something that made even the seasoned production crew take an involuntary step back. When he spoke, his voice was deadly quiet, more menacing than if he had shouted. Cry about it. Cranston repeated slowly, each word precisely enunciated. Jimmy, I've been challenged by critics, by directors, by fellow actors who demanded excellence. I've been challenged by roles that required me to dig deeper than I thought possible. You think this amateur hour interrogation is challenging me? Amateur hour? Kimmel's voice cracked slightly on the words. This show has been on the air for over 20 years. I've interviewed presidents, world leaders, the biggest names in entertainment. Don't you dare sit there and call me an amateur. Then, stop acting like one. Cranston fired back without hesitation. Presidents and world leaders come on your show because they have to, because it's part of the political theater. But they don't respect you, Jimmy. They tolerate you. There's a difference. The brutality of the statement left the studio in complete silence. Even the camera operators seemed frozen, unsure whether they should continue rolling or cut away from what was rapidly becoming a public evisceration. Kimmel's face had gone from red to pale, his eyes wide with shock at the directness of the attack. "You don't know what you're talking about," Kimmel said weakly, but his voice lacked conviction. For the first time since the confrontation began, he seemed genuinely shaken. "Don't I?" Cranston leaned forward, his intensity radiating across the studio like heat from a furnace. "I know exactly what I'm talking about. I know what it's like to earn respect through craft, through dedication, through actually caring about the work. You've built your career on being the guy who tears others down, and now you're upset because someone's finally willing to tear back." The audience was completely silent now, some covering their mouths in shock, others simply staring in disbelief at the carnage unfolding before them. This had moved far beyond uncomfortable television. This was becoming genuinely disturbing too. Witness, Kimmel struggled to regain his footing, his media training warring with his wounded ego. "You know what, Bryan? Maybe you should stick to memorizing other people's words, because clearly thinking for yourself isn't working out so well." It was a desperate attempt at a comeback, but it fell flat, lacking the surgical precision of Cranston's attacks. Worse, it revealed how rattled Kimmel had become, how completely he'd lost control of both the interview and himself. "Other people's words," Cranston repeated with a bitter laugh. "You mean like the words written by some of the most talented writers in television? The words that helped create characters that will be remembered long after your cheap jokes are forgotten?" "Yeah, Jimmy, I'm proud to bring those words to life." "What are you proud of?" The question hung unanswered as Kimmel visibly struggled with his response. His mouth opened and closed several times without sound, like a fish gasping for air. The confident, quick-witted host who had opened the show was nowhere to be found, replaced by a man who looked genuinely lost. "I'm proud of making people laugh," Kimmel finally managed, but even he seemed to realize how weak it sounded in the context of their confrontation. "Making people laugh?" Cranston nodded slowly. "And who are you making laugh tonight, Jimmy? Because, from where I'm sitting, this looks more like you're making people uncomfortable. This looks like you're more interested in humiliating your guests than entertaining your audience." The accusation was devastating in its accuracy. Several audience members were indeed looking genuinely uncomfortable, some checking their phones, as if hoping for an escape from the increasingly toxic atmosphere. The energy in the studio had shifted from anticipation to dread, from entertainment to something that felt almost voyeuristic. Kimmel's recovery attempt came in the form of aggression, his voice rising to nearly a shout. "You came on my show, Bryan. You agreed to this interview. If you can't handle a few tough questions, maybe you should have stayed home." "Tough questions?" Cranston's laugh was devoid of any humor. "Jimmy, you haven't asked me a single question about my work, my craft, or anything that might actually interest your viewers. You've spent this entire time trying to bait me into saying something you can use against me later. That's not journalism. That's entrapment." The word entrapment seemed to strike Kimmel like a physical blow. His face went through another series of color changes as he processed the implications of what Cranston was suggesting. The idea that he had deliberately set up his guest for failure was clearly one he hadn't expected to be called out on so directly. "Entrapment." Kimmel's voice was shrill now, his composure completely abandoned. "I'm asking legitimate questions about your public statements. If you can't defend your own words, that's on you, not me. Defend my words." Cranston stood up suddenly, his chair rolling backward with the force of his movement. The action sent a visible shock through the studio, with several audience members gasping audibly. "I don't need to defend speaking truth to power, Jimmy. But apparently, you need to attack it to feel relevant." Standing over the seated host, Cranston cut an imposing figure. The camera angles suddenly seemed all wrong, with Kimmel looking small and diminished in his chair while Cranston loomed above him like an avenging angel. The power dynamic had shifted completely, and everyone in the studio could feel it. "Sit down," Kimmel said, but his voice lacked authority. It sounded more like a plea than a command. "What?" Cranston asked, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. "So you can continue this pathetic attempt at character assassination? So you can keep pretending this is entertainment instead of what it really is, a desperate grab for relevance from a host who's run out of actual material?" The studio had become a powder keg, and everyone present seemed to sense that something explosive was about to happen. You know what the real tragedy is here, Jimmy, Cranston continued, his voice carrying the weight of genuine disappointment. You had a platform. You had influence. You could have used it to elevate discourse, to bring people together, to actually make a difference. Instead, you chose to be a carnival barker, selling cheap thrills and manufactured outrage to the highest bidder. Kimmel finally found his voice, standing up abruptly to meet Cranston eye to eye. Don't you dare lecture me about my platform. I've raised millions for charity. I've brought attention to important causes. You've what? Cranston interrupted, stepping closer. Hidden your good deeds behind a wall of cynicism and cheap shots? Used charity as a shield while you tear people down for entertainment? That's not noble, Jimmy. That's manipulation. The confrontation had reached its apex. Both men were now standing face to face in the center of the stage, their voices echoing through the stunned silence of the studio. The audience sat frozen, witnessing what felt less like entertainment and more like a public reckoning. Manipulation? Kimmel's voice cracked with indignation. You want to talk about manipulation? What about your little speech at the awards show last year? What about your social media posts? You think that wasn't calculated to get attention? Cranston's laugh was sharp and bitter. Everything I've said publicly, I've said because I believed it needed to be said. Not because it would get me ratings, not because it would trend on social media, but because I have a conscience. Apparently, that's something you wouldn't understand. The personal nature of the attack visibly staggered Kimmel. His face went through a series of emotions: rage, hurt, desperation, before settling on something that looked almost like panic. He was losing this confrontation badly, and everyone in the studio knew it. You sanctimonious piece of, Kimmel started, but Cranston cut him off with a raised hand. Stop, Cranston said firmly. Just stop. This is exactly what I'm talking about. When you can't win with wit or intelligence, you resort to insults. When you can't defend your actions, you attack the person calling you out. It's textbook behavior from someone who's never had to face real consequences for their actions. The cameras captured every moment of Kimmel's visible struggle. His hands were shaking now, his carefully styled hair disheveled from running his fingers through it in frustration. The confident host who had started the show was completely gone, replaced by someone who looked genuinely broken. Real consequences. Kimmel's voice was barely above a whisper. You don't know anything about consequences. You don't know what it's like to have to fill an hour of television every single night, to have to be funny on command, to have to what? Cranston demanded. To do your job? Jimmy, everyone in this business faces pressure. The difference is that most of us don't use that pressure as an excuse to become cruel. The word cruel seemed to penetrate Kimmel's defenses in a way that nothing else had. His shoulders sagged slightly, and for a moment, he looked less like an antagonist and more like someone who had just realized the full extent of his own behavior. Cruel, he repeated quietly, as if testing the word's weight. Yes, cruel, Cranston confirmed, his voice softer now, but no less pointed. Because that's what this is, Jimmy. This ambush, this character assassination disguised as an interview, it's cruel. And the worst part is, you seem to enjoy it. The studio was so quiet that the hum of the cameras was audible. Every person present seemed to be holding their breath, waiting to see how this unprecedented confrontation would resolve itself. The tension was almost unbearable. Kimmel looked around the studio as if seeing it for the first time. His eyes swept over the shocked faces of his audience, the uncomfortable expressions of his crew, the cameras that were recording every moment of his professional humiliation. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow. This is my show, he said weakly. This is my show, and I can ask whatever questions I want. You're right, Cranston nodded. It is your show, and that makes what happened here tonight even more pathetic. You had complete control, home field advantage, and you still managed to make yourself look like the villain. The assessment was devastating in its accuracy. Kimmel had indeed controlled every aspect of the interview. The questions, the format, the environment, and yet he had somehow emerged as the clear antagonist in the confrontation. It was a masterclass in how not to conduct an interview. I'm not the villain, Kimmel protested, but even he seemed to realize how unconvincing he sounded. Aren't you? Cranston asked quietly. Look around, Jimmy. Look at your audience. Look at your crew. Do they look entertained, or do they look embarrassed? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like everyone in this room wishes they were somewhere else." The truth of the statement was undeniable. The audience members were indeed looking uncomfortable, many avoiding eye contact with the stage entirely. Several crew members were shaking their heads or whispering among themselves. The atmosphere in the studio had become genuinely toxic. Kimmel's final attempt at salvaging the situation came in the form of desperate aggression. "If you don't like it, you can leave. Nobody's forcing you to be here." The suggestion hung in the air for several seconds before Cranston nodded slowly. "You know what, Jimmy? You're absolutely right. Nobody is forcing me to be here, and I don't have to subject myself to this anymore." With that, Cranston turned and began walking toward the exit. The movement sent a visible shock through the studio. Guests simply didn't walk out on live television. It was unprecedented, professional suicide, career-ending behavior. Except somehow, in this context, it felt like the only dignified response. "Bryan, wait," Kimmel called out, his voice cracking with panic. The realization that his guest was actually leaving seemed to snap him back to some semblance of professionalism. "We're not done here." Cranston stopped and turned back to face the host one final time. "Yes, Jimmy, we are. We're completely done." The finality in his voice was unmistakable. This wasn't a dramatic pause or a negotiating tactic. This was a man drawing a line in the sand and refusing to cross back over it. "You can't just walk out," Kimmel said desperately. "This is live television. You have obligations, contracts. My only obligation," Cranston interrupted, "is to myself and to the people who respect my work. And staying here, participating in this circus, would be a betrayal of both." With that, he resumed his walk toward the exit. The cameras followed him as he moved through the studio, past the shocked audience members, past the stunned crew members, toward the door that would take him away from what had become one of the most uncomfortable spectacles in late-night television history. "This is unprofessional," Kimmel shouted after him, his voice echoing through the studio. "This is childish." Cranston didn't respond. He didn't even turn around. He simply continued walking until he reached the exit, pushed through the door, and disappeared from view. The sound of the door closing behind him seemed to echo through the studio like a gunshot. For several long moments, nobody moved. Kimmel stood alone in the center of his stage, surrounded by cameras and an audience that had just witnessed his complete professional humiliation. His chest was heaving, his face flushed, his carefully constructed persona in complete ruins. Finally, one of the producers could be heard shouting "cut" from off camera, but the damage was already done. The confrontation had been broadcast live to millions of viewers, recorded for posterity, and would undoubtedly be replayed endlessly across social media and news programs. Kimmel looked around his studio one more time, taking in the shocked faces, the uncomfortable silence, the palpable sense that something irreversible had just occurred. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "Well," he said to no one in particular, "I guess that's a wrap." The words seemed to break the spell that had fallen over the studio. Audience members began talking among themselves. Crew members started moving again, and the normal sounds of a television production slowly returned. But everyone present knew. They had just witnessed something extraordinary. A complete breakdown of the social contract that governed celebrity interviews, a public reckoning that would be talked about for years to come. As the credits rolled over the chaos, one thing was abundantly clear. Jimmy Kimmel had started the evening as a confident host in control of his show, and ended it as a man who had been thoroughly exposed and defeated by a guest who refused to play his games. It was a humiliation so complete, so public, and so richly deserved that it would define both men's careers for years to come. The story had ended not with reconciliation or understanding, but with a powerful demonstration that sometimes walking away is the most devastating response of all.